So here's what's left of the stock exhaust. You all saw the exhaust from the previous video and kind of what the original plans were. As I started going through it though, really the only thing that I ended up using from the exhaust was the flanges. I was originally going to try and utilize some of the mounts, but it didn't kind of work out how I wanted it to. The larger diameter piping was just a little bit too big. But for the most part, I was trying to focus on just matching how the stock exhaust was laid out. Obviously, you can see the extent of the rust with the original exhaust coming off the manifolds here and also going into the post catalysts. So there wasn't really a whole lot salvageable here, and not to mention the catalysts were restricted. Just, 30 years old, not a whole lot you can do with them. And then you can kind of see the original heat shields here that had all the original fiberglass that was kind of stuck in them, which was causing the rust to form in the first place because it was holding on to moisture. So with the rust that we saw in the exhaust, that also meant that there was some issues with the studs coming off the manifolds that were rusted out as well. So I had 4 out of 6 of the studs break, so I ended up having to drill those out. I'm not going to bore y'all with a bunch of videos of me just drilling out studs, so you get one video and that's it. These are just the replacement bolts that I used in replacement of the studs that broke, so they had to be fully drilled out. I wasn't able to salvage the threads, so I just ran bolts and nuts through them, and it worked out fine. And then obviously with this, me having to fabricate a whole new exhaust, this is the welder I was using, so it's a prime weld 225 AC, so it does TIG and arc welding. The exhaust originally was going to be TIG welded, but my skills weren't up to task, so I ended up just going to arc welding, since this is kind of my first time welding. And so this is the stock flange going to the adapter that I'm using. So the stock exhaust is 2 1/4, and the adapter is 2 1/4 to 3 inch. So this is kind of where it begins. After the adapters were welded on, I actually took the adapters and the stock flange to an outside shop to get those welded, just because of the material of the stock flange wasn't great. So I just wanted, that to be professionally done. And since it's the main junction of the exhaust, I didn't want it to crack or break in case I did something wrong. But from here on, everything else is me welding. So this is welding the adapter to the Vibrant Performance resonator. And, for the most part, this went pretty easy. These were probably some of my first welds with the using the arc welder. I'm using, I believe it's 307L stainless steel rod, which is supposed to be for welding stainless together or welding stainless to mild. So yeah, it went pretty well here, especially when you're doing these kind of slip joints. It's kind of hard to mess up, but you can kind of see some of the welds that I have there. And I, for my first welds, I think they look pretty decent. And this is the other side. Nothing really different here. I think for the most part, the experience of welding was really interesting, kind of learning it as I went along. I know it's not an easy thing for people to dive into, but it's something I've always wanted to do. And I think for me personally, it's just best for me just to kind of dive in and figure it out. Obviously I was watching a lot of videos on like how to do it and reading and just things like that on the proper procedure. But no matter how much you read something or watch videos on how to do something, there's still no better experience than just doing it and learning from your mistakes, such as when I'm making holes and, then I learn how to fill those holes or just not make holes at all. So this won't be a typical YouTube video where someone's going to make the best or perfect exhaust, or you're not going to see the perfect exhaust with the perfect welds as a first-time welder. Mistakes are going to be made, and this is just more to kind of show maybe what someone might experience kind of jumping into welding and just wanting to do it kind of in the same way I was, where I just wanted to weld and I wanted to learn, and an opportunity presented itself where I was finally able to get a welder and just kind of dive into it. And this is kind of the result of that. I was able to make an exhaust that for the most part worked and replaced the original exhaust and fulfilled my needs. So this was basically just a picture I took of right after the resonators and piping was welded on. I also got the exhaust hangers welded on. So these were just using some stock hangers or utilizing the stock hanger mounts and then using hanger rods to support it. So this is where I start running into a little bit more issues with welding, because now these are more of the kind of the butt weld connections, and it's all about kind of preparation. And even though I thought I did okay on preparation in terms of like getting a flat surface to weld against, I still was dealing with some issues with gaps, which was causing me to blow holes in the metal. But I learned an important lesson here in terms of welding rods, and that was just because you go to a bigger welding rod to fill in a smaller hole just means you're going to get a bigger hole. But so what I'm trying to do here is that there, for whatever reasons, and this wasn't necessarily from prep, I think some of these pipes were bent during shipping. So as I'm trying to get them to actually connect together, I'm noticing that they're bent. So I'm using the C-clamp to try to bend them back into shape enough to where I can tack them in place to then finish the weld completely, instead of kind of doing like these little spots. So periodically I get up, take it to a vise to kind of crimp down the metal a little bit to just bend it enough so I'm not dealing with a super large gap, and then cleaning up the welds and kind of doing that back and forth. But this particular piece I did end up trying to use a larger rod and then ended up just burning a big hole in it, so it took a while to fill in and made an ugly weld. But you know, it is what it is. We're learning, and the metal's sticking together. So this is after I welded that piece there, and now I'm welding it to the full remaining piece of the exhaust. This went a lot smoother. I wasn't dealing with the issue with the piping being bent or anything like that, so I was able to tack it all the way around without any issues, and then do actual decent passes. I know with arc welding you're supposed to like try to do consistent long passes. The issue I was having is that I'd get through the weld and then I'd have to turn the piece, and it caused me to break the weld. So I was kind of doing stop starts, but didn't really have many issues there. Other than that, once we kind of got the process down, you can kind of see how the mount is on there. Not the prettiest thing, but it works, and it allowed me to utilize these stock rubber mounts. So this is me prepping for the H-pipe going between the two banks. So the stock exhaust used an H-pipe. It was very small. I don't know if you noticed it in the beginning of the video, where I kind of pointed out, but yeah, it's just a tiny little H-pipe on the stock exhaust. So I figured, well, if the stock exhaust had it, we'll put it with a new exhaust. And I know it's good to have the banks connected, or have an H-pipe or an X-pipe. And originally I was going to try and get an X-pipe to fit, but the X-pipe I got with the kit didn't really package very well. The angles were really extreme on the X-pipe to where it just would not package well underneath at least a specific layout. And to be honest, the kit I got it was just like a generic LS swap kit, so it wasn't anything specific to this car. It just had a lot of good angles and straights for a pretty reasonable price, being that it was 304 stainless. So yeah, right now I'm just doing all the measurements and drilling the pilot hole for the hole saw. And then I initially used a Craftsman hole saw, which I think was a mistake, because even though it said it was bimetallic, apparently that doesn't include stainless, since it pretty much just wore all the teeth right off the hole saw before it could really even start cutting into the metal. So you can kind of see that happening here. Once I actually take a look at the hole saw after using it for a little bit, I realize that most of the teeth are just worn away, or they're not even sharp anymore. So once I realized that, I swapped to another hole saw, which I thought was still the proper sizing for what I needed. So it was actually a 2.5-inch hole saw, and this was I think a Milwaukee brand, but it was an actual carbide bit hole saw, or carbide teeth hole saw. And as you can see, it cuts through it pretty easily without any issues. And you'll see here, once I actually get the adapter piece for the H-pipe, the hole is bigger than I was expecting. So you can see there's a gap around the actual adapter. Not a huge, it's a big gap, but it's not the end of the world. It just means I either have to fill it in with some extra filler rod, or I use a little piece to fill in the gap. Again, not the prettiest thing, but it's exhaust. No one's really going to see it. I just need a replacement for the stock exhaust. And this is the only way I could really get anything because they don't make any replacement parts for these Qs anymore. Or at least replacement exhaust parts. So right now you can kind of see I'm welding the H-pipe adapter on. I'm just trying to kind of tack it in each corner so that there's not any warpage that occurs. Since I'm already having to fill in some holes, I don't want to have to fill in even more holes or gaps. And then I'm slowly filling in that back edge with filler rod. So I actually use two different methods to fill it. So the back side is just being filled in with filler rod, and then the front side gets filled in with a piece of scrap from the actual hole saw. Also, you may periodically see me do what it appears to be where I'm welding on the table itself, but I'm actually welding on some scrap coupons. And the reason I'm doing that, at least for me, is for one, so I'm not getting the rod stuck on the initial arc. Again, my skills are low, so I just don't want to keep sticking into the metal because it ends up making the weld even uglier. And I've also found that I'm kind of preheating the rod by striking the arc on the scrap coupons and doing, a several second bead. In my experience, when I do that, it seems to actually keep it makes it much easier for me to strike the arc and not deal with the rod sticking. So as you can see here with the H-pipe adapter, the big gap that I'm kind of left with. So this is what the plan is I'm going to take the scrap that I cut out initially, and I'm just going to cut it at the angle where it matches that section. So this is what we have here, where I have that piece cut out. It's angled enough to where it will sit flush. I kind of manipulated it and massaged it a bit with a vise and got it to the approximate shape where there's not any major gaps. And now I'm able to get it welded in. So I just do a few tacks around it just so there's not any warpage or it's not trying to lift off before I do a full pass, or attempted full passes anyway. There is a little bit of, I think there's a hole that forms, a very small hole that forms at the top, so you'll kind of see me work that area a little bit as I fill that hole, but I'm attempting to do longer passes here, and for the most part it works out okay, but again, holes happen, so it's just a process as I'm getting through them. You'll occasionally see me pull out a center punch. It's what I had around that worked well for clearing the slag out of the hole. So periodically you'll see me just kind of keep hitting it with the center punch, and that's just me getting the slag out of the hole so there's no contamination of the weld as I'm filling the hole. So all of the welds that I'm doing my best to make sure there's no slag remnants or that will contaminate the new welds, just to hopefully keep the welds strong enough to keep the exhaust together. And this is the other side, so the other bank of the exhaust, same thing here. Welding the adapter on and filling in the gaps with filler rod on one side, and then using scrap to fill in the larger hole on the other side. So yeah, I'm not going to show this whole clip because again, it's the same thing, you've already basically seen it. But up next will be the exhaust clip of the H-pipe fully welded. Unfortunately, I don't have any footage of welding the center of the H-pipe. That was done with it on the car, and I basically just tacked the center pipe in, and then pulled the exhaust back off again, and then fully welded everything together. This is what took the majority of the time when building the exhaust, is just being underneath the vehicle and finding the right piping that fits the angles that you need, or cutting the piping and finding the angles, between two pipes, or, welding them together to make the angle you need. I definitely missed having a lift because it would have made this much easier rather than having to crawl underneath the vehicle each time to take measurements, pull the whole exhaust out, kind of, tack weld it or weld everything together, put it back in, redo measurements, rinse, repeat. And in this video, I'm just angling the exhaust down because I'm trying to make sure there's enough clearance for the drive shaft. So I was running the exhaust pretty close to the body and the drive shaft, just because the vehicle is going to get lowered, so I don't want it to be hitting the ground or anything like that. But still, I wasn't comfortable with where it was at, so I was just moving it down an inch or so. From the routing of the piping, I got it to the point where I was able to get the one of the mufflers on here, so this is just me welding in the hanger. And for the hanger, I actually flatten the backside of it, so I'll kind of throw up a picture of it here real quick. I found that this allows the hanger to sit flat against the muffler, which makes it easier to weld, because when you keep the circle, it kind of wants to slide around, or it doesn't want to sit fully flush, and you weren't getting an effective or as effective as a weld with it flat. And this is utilizing one of the stock locations for the original exhaust for the original mufflers. So this is just basically me getting the muffler in the right location, from the routing of the piping, and then just bolting in the stock rubber hanger and then attaching it using the hanger that I welded on. And of course, once you finish the weld, you gotta give it a shake and make sure you say that's not going anywhere. So this is after pulling the exhaust out after welding up the hanger, and figured I'd kind of go through a little bit more detailed view of the exhaust here. And right now, this is just focusing on welding up the downturn for the exhaust, since it's going to be stopping right before the rear subframe. And I'm also kind of showing some of the things issues I'm running into. I don't know if this is from the muffler itself, or again just bent piping from shipping, but you can kind of see the gap all the way around the piping is going into the muffler, so I'm trying to clamp it down just so I don't have as big of a gap. There's a little bit of a hole there that has to get filled. You can kind of see the scrap piece I put in there to cover up the large hole. Doesn't look pretty, but it works. And then this is kind of the rest of the exhaust going all the way up to the stock flanges. So, there's some decent looking welds here and there. For the most part, I guess you'd probably maybe call them or consider them booger welds, but it's holding together. So this is where I'm just welding on the downturns, and I mainly focus on just the top and the sides. The reason I didn't do all the way around is at some point I might cut these off and finish routing the exhaust away to the back. There's additional piping I need to get. I need to get actual oval piping to clearance the subframe, so I don't have to worry about that. And this is just one of many videos of me forming and flattening the piping so that I can get a flat edge as I do the actual butt welds. This is really the only video that I'm going to share because they're all pretty much the same. I'm not going to bore y'all with repeat videos of just grinding down metal. I experienced that enough while putting the exhaust together. I'm not going to force you to. But yeah, this is probably the most important part of this entire process, is just making sure the metal is clean, it's flat, there's no high spots or low spots, and then just making sure the surface area is clean too before you start the weld. And it's the best chance of me not making holes in things. So this is the pipe that I had just cleaned up in the previous video. And I already had it tacked from the bottom, so I had flipped it over, and now I'm tacking it in and welding it in on the other side. Again, you can kind of see the same thing is happening here that's happened in some of the other ones, where I'm having to use a C-clamp to help form the connection a little bit better, or kind of bend it back into place. kind of going back and forth with that, just getting different angles to try to just get that gap just as small as I can get it. I think I maybe made one hole on this pipe here. For the most part though, it went okay. I had been fighting around this section for some time and finally just kind of gave up using the C-clamp in this area. As there's still a gap and I can't get it to bend, so I just end up taking out the hammer and hitting that actual area with the hammer to just bend it down just a little bit, which worked, and I was able to get a weld across without actually making any holes for once. And then I kind of went across it again just to make sure I got decent penetration. And that one went through okay. And you'll see me using a punch here, and this is replacing my center punch. And again, it's just cleaning out the slag that's in the crevices. So this is full caveman brain in action. I'm trying to bend this hanger slightly to match the curve I need to match it to the muffler. And so I'm just heating it up in this section and then pulling on it to bend it just enough. And the main issue I'm having here is that actually the whole table is flexing with the vise, because unfortunately the vise is mounted to a wooden table, so the plywood is flexing, which is taking a lot of the energy out for me to get this to bend. But I was able to kind of brace against the table with my leg and just push against the vise to try to get some counter force to limit the amount of flex in the table and get the hanger to bend just enough for what I needed. And this is the start on the passenger side exhaust. So I finally have the muffler in place, and right now I'm just tack welding it before I pull it all back down to do the full welds. And this is the exhaust that the hanger I just bent is going to. So I just finished tacking it in, and then I move on to getting the hanger installed. And then at this moment I realize that the muffler is covered in fingerprints, so I better wipe those off before I start any welds so that it doesn't have any contamination or trouble welding. Despite that, I still end up running into some issues getting my arc to start. One thing to mention in this section here is the exhaust is routed in a way where it's not necessarily symmetrical to the driver's side. So you'll see here and here the muffler is routed right next to the stock heat shield on the passenger side. In the back here, the driver's side actually does not have a heat shield in the same location. And the reason for that is because the areas I'm pointing out, you have the fuel lines running through. So the angle of the exhaust was put specifically in an area to avoid the stock fuel lines and stay right in that same area where the stock heat shield was. So this was essentially the last time I'm going to drop the exhaust, so I figured I'd capture it and just kind of show roughly what you have to do to drop the exhaust each time. It's pretty simple, honestly, because the way that the exhaust is routed, even the stock exhaust, it all just runs completely underneath everything. So once you take off all the bolts, it just drops straight down. But in this case, because I don't have access to the lift, it makes things a little bit difficult just to maneuver everything out of there. And the one issue I run into here is that previously I've been dropping the exhaust where it just has, one or no mufflers on it, and now I have both mufflers on, and that creates a bit of a problem right at the end, but not a big deal. I'm able to resolve it with some manipulation of the exhaust to get out of there. But yeah, so again, dropping the exhaust is kind of a multi-stage process at this point, because roughly right now, I'd say the whole assembly weighs probably around between 50 and 70 pounds, but it's awkward because a lot of the weight is on the rear because of the mufflers. And while that's not a lot, it's awkward to maneuver underneath the car. But yeah, at this point, I got it down on the ground, and now I realize, because now I have both mufflers on, it doesn't fit through the jack stands in the way that I normally take it out. So you can kind of see my moment of realization here. And I got it out by sliding it out through the sides, getting it on a creeper to give it some extra mobility. And then finished welding everything up and then doing the same thing and sliding it back underneath with the creeper and bolting it back in, and now we're ready for the moment of truth. The next footage is audio of the exhaust from the interior during a 5-minute test drive. Along with the exhaust work, I'd also completed a 4-wheel brake job. You'll see more of this in the next video. So you'll see me stopping periodically and then reaccelerating. This is to burnish the new pads and help get them to bed in properly. And that'll do it for this episode. And the next episode, I'll be going over the installation of the BC Racing coilovers and the 4-wheel brake job. Thanks for watching.